Jessica Williams stood in her bathroom. She was wearing a silk robe. The soft sound of music played in the background. The steam from her bath filled the room. Her bathroom was her special place. It was a break from the quiet of her home in the suburbs. Her husband, Mark, had left early that morning for another one of his business trips. He was often traveling for work. Jessica had grown accustomed to feeling alone, and her days were filled with a routine that blended together. She pulled the sash of her silk robe tighter around her. The smooth fabric brushed against her skin as she stood in her bathroom. She lit a vanilla-scented candle and took a moment to breathe deeply, her mind drifting to the simple pleasure of a bath. The weight of years spent managing a household in isolation seemed to lift as she dipped a toe into the warm water, the heat inviting her to let go of. But then she heard a noise. She froze. She wasn't expecting anyone. Mark had said he'd be gone until the weekend. Her pulse quickened as she tried to hear over the faint music playing from her phone. She brushed the thought away. It was probably the wind or maybe something else. Jessica's worries grew when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She wasn't expecting anyone, and Mark had said he'd be gone until the weekend. She listened for a moment, but she couldn't hear anything over the music on her phone. Maybe it was just the wind or the neighbor's cat, who liked to walk around her porch. But the footsteps seemed too real. Jessica stepped out of the bathtub, her feet hitting the cold tiles. She was nervous and a little scared, but she also felt curious. She looked out into the hallway, her robe clinging to her wet skin. The footsteps sounded in the hallway. It was the neighbor's cat, but it was strange that it was so loud. Jessica felt scared, but she also felt curious. She was wearing a silk robe and her feet were cold. She looked around the hallway, which was dark. She wanted to call out, but she also wanted to believe that she was imagining the footsteps. She thought about putting her hand on the doorknob. If someone was there, they should come in. The footsteps got closer and louder. The sound of her heartbeat grew louder and louder. She was about to reach for her phone. Then, the bathroom door opened. There he was, her stepson standing in the doorway. His face showed shock and apology. The warm afternoon light showed his figure. His tousled, dark hair was still damp from the rain outside. His athletic frame was frozen. He stood in the doorway, as if he couldn't move. Jessica was frozen. She wanted to pull the robe tighter around herself, but the robe only emphasized the silk, which clung to her curves. Her cheeks burned as she realized how exposed she felt, not just physically, but emotionally. She felt very vulnerable. She was caught off guard, and she felt a rush of adrenaline. She grabbed a towel from the rack. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his mouth opening and closing. He looked away, as if he couldn't answer. "I didn't think anyone was home," he stammered. His deep voice sounded strange. She was surprised. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I didn't think anyone was home," she said, her voice also shaking. "I came by to grab my gym bag." "I didn't mean to," he said, but she didn't understand. Her mind raced as she remembered the moment, including the way his eyes had locked on hers and how his gaze had moved down before he turned away, his face red. Jessica felt a mix of embarrassment and anger. She didn't mean to, but she overheard him saying something. She tried to focus, but her mind was racing. She remembered his eyes looking at her, and how he looked away quickly. Her face felt hot and her body felt tense. She felt angry, but she couldn't explain why. She said quickly, "It's fine," but her voice was sharp. She wanted to leave, so she did. Nathan nodded quickly and left the room. Her reaction was also unsettling. She felt angry and more emotions she couldn't name. "It's fine," she said quickly, her tone sharper than she intended. She was just trying to get him to leave. Nathan nodded and quickly left the room, as though he was running away from a crime scene. "Sorry, I'll go," Jessica said. She stood there for a moment, the towel held against her chest like armor. She listened to the sound of his footsteps as he left. Her legs felt weak, her breath came in short, shallow breaths as she tried to steady herself against the bathroom counter. She caught her reflection in the mirror. Her cheeks were flushed. Her hair was damp, and she was staring at herself in the mirror. The woman in the mirror was someone she barely recognized. She was shaken, not just by an awkward encounter. She sank onto the edge of the bathtub. The steam was now going up into the tense air of the room. Her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. It was just she was shocked and embarrassed by what had happened, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. She remembered Nathan's eyes, and how they had looked at her. She felt like she couldn't stop thinking about it, even though she knew she shouldn't. She stood up in the bathtub, and her movements felt like they were automatic. Jessica drained the bath water and extinguished the candle. She needed to shake this off and put the incident behind her. But as she stepped into the hallway, she couldn't ignore the faint scent of Nathan's cologne in the air or the way her pulse quickened at the thought of facing him. Jessica spent the rest of the afternoon in a haze. She did chores, scrubbed surfaces that didn't need cleaning, and folded laundry meticulously. No amount of distraction could erase the memory of that moment. It wasn't just the embarrassment that lingered, it was the intensity of it. Jessica spent the rest of the afternoon doing chores. She scrubbed surfaces that didn't need cleaning and folded laundry, but she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She felt embarrassed, and the experience was very intense. It had jolted her out of the boredom of her days. By the time dinner rolled around, Jessica felt like a coiled spring. Every sound was loud, and every movement was deliberate. When Nathan came back into the kitchen, his steps were tentative. Jessica could feel the tension in the air. They exchanged the way it had shocked her out of the boredom of her days, like a spark catching dry kindling. By the time dinner rolled around, Jessica felt like a coiled spring, every sound amplified, every movement deliberate. When Nathan reappeared in the kitchen, his steps were hesitant. The tension was almost unbearable. They exchanged polite, stilted words, both avoiding the subject, hanging like a dark cloud between them. Mark's absence had never felt so obvious. His chair at the table was a glaring reminder of everything Jessica had tried to ignore about her life. When Nathan finally retreated to his room, Jessica let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She realized she had been holding it in, but the relief was short-lived. The house felt heavier, and the silence no longer felt comforting but oppressive. As she climbed into bed that night, her mind refused to quiet, replaying every second of the encounter with a clarity that made her skin prickle. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. She realized she'd been holding, but the relief was short-lived. The house felt heavier, and the silence no longer felt comforting but felt forced. As she climbed into bed that night, her mind wouldn't quiet. It replayed every second of the encounter, and she felt a prickling sensation all over her body. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of her own feelings. Was it guilt? Or embarrassment? Or was it something deeper? She wasn't ready to confront whatever it was. It had cracked something open inside her. She couldn't quite name it, but she couldn't ignore it anymore. Finally, she fell asleep, but one thought lingered. She felt heavy and unshakable. She couldn't escape the feeling that she knew what would happen next. If she thought this was just a passing awkward moment, she was wrong. What followed would test the very foundations of her carefully constructed life, unraveling emotions and boundaries she never imagined crossing. The following morning, Jessica Williams awoke to the warm light of the California sun streaming through her bedroom window. But there was no comfort in its golden glow. Her chest felt tight, and her mind was still tangled in the events of the previous day. The memory of Nathan standing in the bathroom doorway was as vivid as if it had just happened, and she could still see his eyes widening. His cheeks flushed quickly, and there was tension in the air between them. Jessica got out of bed slowly, as if every step was more difficult than normal. She wrapped her robe around herself, but the silk, which had felt luxurious before, now felt fragile. Jessica got up slowly, her movements deliberate, as though every step required more effort than usual. She wrapped her robe around herself, but the silk, which had once felt luxurious, felt like a fragile barrier. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of a breeze rustling the trees outside. Mark had texted late the night before, a brief and impersonal message about an extended trip, leaving Nathan. Jessica tried to steel herself. She told herself it had been a simple mistake, and awkward. The house felt silent, except for the sound of the wind in the trees outside. Mark had sent a short, unfriendly text about an extended trip the night before. Nathan was going down the stairs. Jessica tried to distract herself. She told herself it had been an accident, a strange moment that would go away soon, but deep down, she knew the mood in the house had changed. The air felt heavy, as if you could see it, but you couldn't shake it. When she went into the kitchen, she found Nathan already there, leaning against the counter with a coffee mug. He looked up when he heard her. Jessica felt the tension in the air. It was hard to breathe. She knew something was wrong, but she wasn't sure what. When she went into the kitchen, Nathan was there. He was leaning against the counter, drinking a coffee. He looked up when she came in. For a second, they looked at each other. Then he looked away. He was sad. He said something, but it was low and quiet. Jessica said, "Good morning," and tried to smile. But she didn't feel like it. She didn't want to talk to him. She didn't want to make things worse. They looked at each other, but quickly looked away. Nathan seemed upset. He didn't say much. Jessica smiled and said, "Good morning," but didn't make him a coffee. She wanted to do something to make the silence better, but she couldn't think of anything. She felt like she was talking, but everything she said felt fake. "How's your sleep?" she finally asked. Nathan's answer was short and nervous. "You," Jessica said. Jessica turned to face Nathan, gripping the counter for support. Her mind was racing, trying to think of something to say to make the awkward silence more comfortable. "How's your sleep?" she finally asked, her tone casual. "Fine," Nathan said, his voice shaky. "Jessica, I'm not thinking about much these days. I'm not sure how to respond to you." She was nervous, and she didn't know why. Jessica was upset about what had happened the day before, and she wanted to know why. "It's fine. We don't have to talk about it," Nathan said quickly, cutting her off. "But maybe we should," Jessica said, her voice firmer. "It was just an awkward moment." Jessica felt guilty and something else she couldn't quite name. She was tired of talking about yesterday. She began to say something, but Nathan shook his head quickly, cutting her off. "It's fine. We don't have to talk about it, but maybe we should." Jessica said, her voice was firmer now. "It was just an awkward moment, nothing more." "More right? Nathan said too quickly. His tone betrayed him. He said as he set the coffee down with a little too much force. The mug clinked against the counter. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to," Jessica interjected, her voice softening. "It's okay. Let's just move on," Nathan nodded, but the tension in his shoulders showed he wasn't listening. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to," Jessica said, her voice gentle. "It's okay. Let's just move on," Nathan said, but his shoulders still showed his tension. Jessica felt it, too. She felt a knot in her stomach that grew worse with every second. She turned away and focused on her coffee, as if stirring it would calm her down. The rest of the day was filled with ups and downs, with Jessica and Nathan carefully avoiding each other. Jessica felt uneasy. She tried to distract herself from the tension by doing chores, but she kept worrying about Nathan. Every time she heard him or saw him, her heart raced. By late afternoon, Jessica was in the living room, folding laundry. The repetitive motion of folding towels and socks was almost hypnotic, making her feel a little better. Nathan came into the room, and his presence broke the fragile bubble that Jessica had created around herself. She needed help, so she asked him, his voice tentative. Jessica hesitated, her hands pausing mid-shore. She finally said, her tone cautious, "Finally, Nathan, sit down on the couch and reach for a pile of clothes." They worked in silence at first, the only sound being the soft rustling of fabric. But the quiet wasn't the comfortable kind. It was the kind that pressed down on Jessica, making her acutely aware of every movement and every glance. When their hands brushed over a t-shirt, Jessica felt a strong, sudden feeling. She pulled her hand back quickly, hoping Nathan hadn't noticed. But when she glanced at him, his face showed that he had noticed. His eyebrows were raised, and his lips were parted as if he was about to say something. "Shirt," Jessica felt a strong, sudden feeling. She pulled her hand back quickly, hoping Nathan hadn't noticed. But when she glanced at him, his face showed that he was worried. His lips parted as if he was about to say something, but he didn't. "You okay, Nathan?" he asked after a long pause. His voice was filled with concern and something else. Jessica said too quickly, her voice betraying her. She's tired, Nathan didn't say, but his gaze lingered on her. His eyes searched hers for something she wasn't. Okay, Nathan said after a long pause. His voice was full of concern and more than he could say. I'm tired, Jessica said too quickly, her voice showing it. I understand, Nathan said, but his eyes looked at her in a way that wasn't there. Jessica stood up quickly. She gathered the folded clothes into a neat stack. I should put these away, she said. Her voice was tight as she walked down the hallway. Jessica felt like she was suffocating under the weight of her own thoughts. Her pulse was erratic, and her mind was racing with questions she didn't dare ask. Why couldn't she shake the memory of the bathroom? Why did Nathan's presence feel so different now, so charged that night? Jessica sat alone on the back porch, a glass of wine in her hand. The air was warm, and the stars scattered across the sky. Like tiny pinpricks of light, she had hoped the quiet would calm her, but it only made her feel more troubled. She thought about his absence, feeling both freeing and guilty. Nathan's presence left an empty space, and she thought about herself, caught in. She felt like she was in the middle of a storm, and she hadn't seen it coming. When Nathan joined her on the porch, her heart beat faster. He carried a beer in his hand, and his footsteps were slow as he approached. If I sit? He asked. His voice was soft. Jessica gestured to the empty chair beside her. Go ahead. We'll sit, she said. In the middle of a storm, Jessica felt a surge of surprise when Nathan joined her on the porch. He carried a beer and walked toward her, his footsteps light and uncertain. If I sit? He asked, his voice soft. Go ahead, Jessica said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the night filling the space between them. Jessica could feel Nathan's eyes on her, and when she finally turned to look at him, his expression was readable. You seem different, Nathan said finally, his voice low and like you're carrying something heavy. Jessica didn't know how to respond. She looked away, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass. It's nothing, she said, her voice lacking conviction. Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. If you ever want to talk about it, he began, but he trailed off. Jessica didn't answer the offer. She couldn't. She felt pressure from unspoken words, and it was hard to breathe. She wanted to tell him to leave and go back inside and give her space, but she didn't. Instead, she sat there, feeling many emotions she couldn't name or control. The night felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. Jessica felt like whatever came next would change everything. The evening came to Manor Hills with a calm that seemed to belong in a different world. Jessica Williams felt tension at home. The living room lamp's warm amber glow showed the tidy spaces she had spent the day perfecting. The scent of lavender cleaner still hung in the air, hiding the worry she felt. She stood by the kitchen sink and stared at her reflection in the window as she washed her hands. The running water did little to drown out the noise in her mind. Mark had left on another business trip earlier that morning. His departure was as sudden as always, but this time his absence felt different. Jessica was trying to shake the thought, telling herself it was just the natural loneliness of an empty home, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. Nathan, her stepson, was upstairs, and his presence was hard to ignore. She couldn't escape the creaks of the floorboards above or the faint echoes of his movements. They were alone together, and the day had passed in strange silence. Jessica had avoided Nathan as much as possible, keeping herself busy with tasks that required she tried to focus, but she couldn't stop thinking about the day's events. As the evening went on, she felt restless and started pacing in the kitchen. She thought that movement might help her feel better, but it didn't. She heard a faint thud upstairs, and her pulse quickened. She told herself it was just Nathan moving around, but the noise made her nervous. She felt a subtle tremor, and she wiped her hands on a dish towel. Before pouring herself a glass of wine, she took a sharp, almost bitter sip, which made her feel a little better, if only for a moment. Jessica leaned against the counter and stared at the candle she had lit earlier. The soft vanilla scent mixed with the wine on her breath, making her feel more awake. She closed her eyes, hoping the tension in her shoulder would ease up, but it didn't. The sound of footsteps on the staircase made her eyes open. Jessica took a sharp, almost bitter sip of her wine. She turned toward the doorway, and he appeared a moment later. His disheveled hair and casual clothes showed that he hadn't been able to sleep. He paused when he saw her, and their eyes met with a hesitation that made her stomach flip. He couldn't sleep either, he said. He was nervous too. His voice was low and soft. He looked at her, and she shook her head and smiled a little. No, just restless, she said. I guess so, Nathan said. He walked into the room. He moved slowly, as if thinking hard. He stood in the room, and it felt like he was filling the space. His voice was low and soft, as if he had been thinking deeply. Jessica shook her head, smiling slightly. Not just restless, I guess, Nathan said, stepping further into the room. He moved with a kind of quiet thoughtfulness, his presence filling the space in a way that felt both comforting and unsettling. He gestured toward the wine bottle on the counter. Mind if I join you? Jessica hesitated for the briefest of moments before nodding her head. Sure, grab a glass. Nathan did as she said, the faint clink of glass on granite breaking the silence. He poured himself a generous amount, his movements unhurried, as if trying to prolong the inevitable. When he finally took a seat at the small kitchen table, Jessica followed her own wine glass, still in hand. They sat across from each other, the fragile barrier between them for a while, neither speaking. Silence stretched out like a tight rope. Jessica studied Nathan's face, seeing his features more clearly in the dim light. He looked tense, with a faint crease between his brows, hinting at the thoughts racing behind his calm exterior. It's weird, isn't it? Nathan said suddenly. The silence felt strange, didn't it? Nathan said, his voice breaking the quiet. He looked up at Jessica, his expression unreadable. She tilted her head, pretending to be confused. What is happening here? Just the two of us? We feel different. Her breath hitched, but she quickly covered it up with a sip of wine. I suppose it does, she said, her tone careful. Jessica's voice was shaking. She looked up at him, her face showing she wasn't sure what to think. What is happening here? Just the two of us? We feel different. Her breathing got faster, but she quickly drank some wine to calm down. I suppose it does, she said, her voice neutral. Nathan leaned back in his chair and looked at her, his eyes searching for something she wasn't sure she wanted him to see. I've been thinking about the other day, Jessica said, her stomach moving up and down as she held her wine glass tightly. She put it down. Neutral. Nathan leaned back in his chair, drinking his wine. He looked at her, searching for something she wasn't sure she wanted him to find out. I've been thinking about the other day, Jessica said, nodding her head. She set her wine glass on the table, taking care to do so. Nathan, we don't need to. I know he interrupted you, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. But I can't pretend it didn't happen, and I don't think you can either, Nathan. Jessica's pulse quickened, and she was sure her heart was pounding loudly. She felt his gaze on her, and his voice, firm but not unkind, made her heart race. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of his gaze and the intensity in his voice was too much, too close to the truth. She had been avoiding Nathan's hesitations, and her fingers tightened around his glass. I don't want things to be weird between us. You're important to me, more than you probably realized, he said, his words catching her off guard. She felt her resolve wavering, and the walls she had built around herself began to crumble. She reached across the table, she touched his arm. It was for a second, but it was enough to make her feel excited. Nathan, we can't. I know, she said quietly. I know, but I still feel this way. She pulled her hand back quickly, as if she had been burned. Her thoughts were a mix of guilt, fear, and something else she couldn't name. She stood up quickly, her chair scraping the floor. I think it's best if we both get some sleep, she said. Her tone was sharp. Nathan didn't argue, but... She pulled her hand back quickly, as if she had been burned. Her thoughts were a mix of guilt, fear, and something else she couldn't name. She stood up quickly, her chair making a noise as it scraped against the floor. I think it's best if we both get some sleep, she said. Her tone was sharp. Nathan didn't argue, but his eyes showed that he was thinking about it. As she left the room and stayed with her, long after she had closed her bedroom door, Jessica stared at the ceiling. Her mind was racing. She couldn't deny the pull she felt toward Nathan. The way he seemed to fill a void she hadn't even realized was wrong. She knew it was wrong, but she still remembered his voice and his touch. Look in his eyes as she left the room and stayed with her long after she had closed her bedroom door. Lying in bed, Jessica stared at the ceiling. Her mind was racing. She couldn't deny the pull she felt toward Nathan. The way his presence seemed to fill a void she hadn't even realized was there, but it was wrong. She knew it was wrong, and yet the memory of his voice and his touch lingered, refusing to be pushed aside as the house settled into silence once more. Jessica turned on her side, clutching the pillow as if it could anchor her to reality. But deep down, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Something had shifted. An invisible line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The days that followed the late-night conversation in the kitchen. Jessica couldn't explain how or when things had changed, but the tension in the house had increased. It wasn't just awkwardness anymore. It was something deeper, something that made every interaction with Nathan uncomfortable. It was in the way he looked at her for a longer than usual amount of time, the way her heart beat faster whenever she thought about him. Jessica felt uneasy. She tried to ignore her feelings, but she couldn't. She felt tense and nervous around Nathan. She felt his gaze on her, and her heart would skip a beat when she heard his footsteps. She tried to distract herself by doing chores, but she couldn't stop thinking about him. The walls, the creaks on the floorboards, and the refrigerator all seemed to make her feel even more anxious. Jessica tried to distract herself from her thoughts about their moments together by doing chores, but it didn't work. She kept glancing at the clock, hoping to see Nathan again. Every time she heard his footsteps or his voice in the distance, her heart beat faster, and she felt emotions she didn't want to feel. One afternoon, Jessica found herself in the living room, feeling very upset. Jessica was folding laundry in the living room as the sun went down. The soft golden light made the room feel warm, but Jessica felt cold and uncertain. She was folding a fitted sheet, which she usually hated. Nathan appeared in the doorway. He was in the room, and Jessica felt him. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was casual, but he sounded worried. She was folding laundry as the sun went down. The soft golden light bathed the room, making it feel warm even though she was nervous. She was folding a fitted sheet, which she usually hated. When Nathan appeared in the doorway, his presence filled the room. Jessica hesitated when she heard him ask for help. She turned to face him, and the sheet slipped from her hands. "She was sure," she said, her voice softer than usual. Nathan stepped closer, his movements deliberate yet unhurried. He sat on the edge of the couch, his long legs stretching out as he reached for a pile of clothes. Jessica resumed folding her fingers, fumbling with the fabric. The air between them felt thick with tension. They worked in silence for a while. Their movements were almost hypnotic, but Jessica couldn't ignore the way her senses seemed to heighten in his presence. She was acutely aware of the faint scent of his cologne, the warmth of his body just a few feet away, and the quiet sound of his breathing when their hands brushed over a t-shirt as the space between them grew smaller. They worked in silence for a while. The rhythm of their movements was almost hypnotic, but Jessica couldn't ignore the way her senses seemed to heighten in his presence. She was acutely aware of the faint scent of his cologne, the warmth of his body just a few feet away, and the quiet sound of his breathing when their hands brushed over a shirt. Jessica felt a jolt, a spark that shot through her like an electric current. She pulled her hand back instinctively, her breath catching in her throat. Nathan paused, his gaze flicking to her face. His expression was unreadable. "Sorry," she murmured. "It's okay," Nathan said, but he didn't look away. His eyes held hers, and for a moment, the room seemed. Shirt, Jessica felt a shock, a sudden jolt of energy. She pulled her hand back quickly, her breath catching in her throat. Nathan paused, his gaze moving to her face, his expression unreadable. "Sorry," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's okay," Nathan said, but he didn't look away. His eyes held hers, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink, narrowing until it felt like they were the only two people in the world. Jessica's heart raced as her thoughts became a chaotic tangle, and she tried to break the spell. "I think that's everything," she said quickly. Gathering the folded clothes into a neat stack, she stood abruptly, clutching the piles like a shield as she moved toward the hallway. Jessica tried to shrink the space between them until they felt like they were the only two people in the world. Her heart raced as she tried to break the spell. "I think that's everything," she said quickly. Gathering the folded clothes into a neat stack, she stood abruptly, clutching the piles like a shield as she moved toward the hallway. But Nathan's voice stopped her. Jessica froze, the sound of her name hanging in the air like a challenge. Slowly, she turned to face him, her grip on the clothes tightening. Nathan stood, his movement slow and deliberate as he closed the distance between them. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said. His voice was low but steady. The words sent a shiver through her, her breath catching as Jessica couldn't stop thinking about Nathan. She looked at him, trying to see if he would stop talking, but he didn't seem to hesitate. "Nathan, this can't go on," she said, her voice shaking. "We have to stop." He looked at her, his eyes serious. "Jessica, I'm not a kid anymore," he said, his voice firm but not angry. She looked at him, trying to figure out if he was being serious. "Nathan, this isn't right," she said, her voice shaking. "Jessica, you're not a kid anymore," he said, his voice firm but not harsh. She felt embarrassed, and she wasn't sure why. She wanted to end the conversation, but she couldn't move. She was stuck where she was, listening to him, and wanting him to be near her. "Nathan, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jessica felt her cheeks flush, embarrassed, but she couldn't explain why. She wanted to end the conversation, but she couldn't move. She was stuck where she was, listening to him talk, and wanting him to be near. "Nathan, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't right. Why does it feel like it is?" He walked closer to her. His hand touched hers. It was short, but it made her feel excited. Jessica's breath was fast and hard to catch. She felt many emotions, including fear, guilt, and desire. It was all too much for her. "I need some air," she said, taking her hand away and going to the back door. She went out on the porch, where the cool evening air felt good. "Why does it feel like it is?" Nathan asked, taking a step closer. His hand touched hers, and they felt an electric shock. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She felt many emotions, including fear, guilt, and desire. It was all too much for her. "I need some air," she said, taking her hand away and going to the back door. She went out on the porch, where the cool evening air hit her like a wave. Jessica held the railing, her knuckles white as she tried to calm herself. Her heart was racing, and her mind replayed the conversation in vivid detail. A moment later, she heard the door open behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Nathan. His presence was unmistakable. He had a magnetic force that drew her in, even when she wanted to resist. The air hit her like a wave. Jessica held the railing, her voice cracking as she tried to stay calm. Her heart was racing, and her mind replayed the conversation in vivid detail. A moment later, she heard the door open behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Nathan. His presence was unmistakable, like a magnetic force that drew her in, even when she wanted to push him away. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable," Nathan said, his voice soft. "I just needed to say it." Jessica turned to face him, her arms wrapped around herself as if to ward off the chill. "You don't understand what you're asking," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. "Maybe not," Nathan admitted, stepping closer. "But I know how I feel, and I think you do, too." "I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable," Nathan said, his voice soft. "I just needed to say it." Jessica turned to face him, her arms wrapped around herself as if to ward off the cold. "You don't understand what you're asking," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. "Maybe not," Nathan admitted, stepping closer. "But I know how I feel, and I think you do, too." Jessica's chest tightened, and her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but she couldn't. The truth hung between them, undeniable and inescapable. The silence stretched out, heavy and charged, until Jessica finally looked away, unable to hold his gaze any longer. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. Jessica's chest felt tight. She felt many strong emotions, and she didn't know how to handle them. She wanted to say that he was wrong, but she couldn't find the words. The truth was obvious and unavoidable. The silence felt long and uncomfortable, and Jessica looked away. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "Just can't." Nathan nodded slowly. He looked disappointed, but he also understood. "I'll give you space," he said quietly. "But I'm not going anywhere." As he turned and walked back inside, Jessica felt a strong desire for him that she couldn't ignore. She stood on the porch for a long time, staring out at the darkening sky as the weight of the evening pressed down on her. "I'll give you space, but I'm not going anywhere," Nathan said quietly. Jessica felt a pang of longing she couldn't ignore. She stood on the porch for a long time, staring out at the darkening horizon as the weight of the evening pressed down on her. The line between right and wrong had never felt so blurred, so impossible to navigate. Deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning. The house was quiet that evening, save for the faint hum of the television in the living room. Jessica sat on the plush couch, her body draped in an oversized sweater and leggings. The soft fabric did little to shield her from the storm. Jessica felt confused about right and wrong. She felt this way a lot. She was watching a movie on the couch. It was a rom-com, a movie she had seen many times. But tonight, the movie felt different. It felt like the tension in the air was different. Nathan was sitting on the other side of the couch. A movie was playing on the screen. It was a rom-com, a genre Jessica had seen many times before. However, the happy scenes didn't seem related to the tension in the room. She wasn't alone. Nathan sat on the couch across from her. He seemed to ignore the space between them, as if it weren't there. He had come downstairs earlier. His presence was unexpected, but not unannounced. They hadn't spoken much since their conversation on the porch a few nights ago. But tonight, the silence between them felt different. It felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Jessica kept her gaze on the television, but he had come downstairs earlier, his presence unannounced but not unexpected. They hadn't spoken much since their conversation on the porch a few nights ago, but tonight the silence between them felt different. It felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Jessica kept her gaze on the television, but she wasn't watching. She was aware of Nathan and the way his arm rested along the back of the couch. She was also aware of the way his knee brushed hers when he shifted. The subtle warmth of his presence made her heart thud in her chest, and she couldn't maintain the calm facade she was trying to show. "Do you even like this movie?" Nathan suddenly asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. She wasn't paying attention to the movie. She was thinking about Nathan and how his arm was on the couch and his knee was touching hers when he moved. His warm presence made her heart beat faster, and she felt like she was pretending to be calm. "Do you even like this movie?" Nathan asked suddenly, his voice sounding surprised. Jessica looked at him, surprised by the question. His tone was light and teasing, but his eyes showed that he was serious, and she started to breathe quickly. She emitted a small nervous laugh. "It's just, something to fill the silence." Nathan nodded, his eyes still on her. "I get that," he said softly. "Sometimes silence can feel heavy." Jessica looked back at the screen. She looked at him, surprised by the question. His tone was light, teasing, but his eyes showed intensity, making her breath catch. She emitted a small nervous laugh. "It's just, something to fill the silence." Nathan nodded. His gaze never left hers. "I get that," he said softly. "Sometimes silence can feel heavy." Jessica turned back to the screen, her cheeks flushing under his stare. She reached for her wine glass and took a slow sip to steady herself. The liquid was warm and smooth, but it did little to calm the growing unease coiling in her chest. "I can change it if you want," she offered, her voice quieter now, almost tentative. "I'm fine. I'm not really watching anyway." Jessica's hand froze mid, her cheeks flushed under his intense gaze. She took a slow sip of her wine, hoping it would calm her nerves. "I can change the subject if you want," she offered, her voice quieter now, almost timid. "No, it's fine. I'm not really watching anyway," Nathan replied, his words heavy and unsettling. Jessica's hand fell still, her fingers trembling slightly. The room felt smaller, the air thick with tension. She could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air between them. Nathan moved closer, so subtly it could have been an accident, but Jessica understood. Her pulse quickened as she felt his arm gently touch hers. She wanted to move, to create some distance between them, but her body felt frozen. She felt an invisible force holding her in place. Jessica, Nathan said. His voice was low and steady. She turned to him, their eyes meeting, and in that moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. The movie, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, it all disappeared, leaving only the two of them in the dimly lit room. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said. His tone was sincere, but "I need to know what you feel." Jessica's breath caught in her throat, her thoughts spiraling as she searched for an answer. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, but the truth was there, staring her in the face. She felt it pull, the spark, the undeniable connection that defied logic and reason. She began, her voice trembling. She looked away, her hands twisting in her lap as Jessica felt overwhelmed. She looked at Nathan. Her heart was racing. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was crazy, but she knew the truth. She felt a strong, inexplicable connection to him. Her voice was shaking as she said, "Nathan, this is complicated. It doesn't have to be." His voice was soft but firm. He said that sometimes things just happen, and they might not be what we expect, but that doesn't make them any less real. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. His words broke something inside her. She had spent so long trying to control her emotions and pretend that everything was okay. She tried to say, "Nathan, this is complicated. It doesn't have to be." His voice was soft but firm. "Sometimes things just happen. They might not be what we expected, but that doesn't make them any less real." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. His words broke something inside her. She had spent so long trying to control her emotions and maintain a facade, but now, in the presence of his honesty, she felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble. "Nathan, you don't understand," she said, voice shaking. "This isn't just about feelings. There are consequences to things we can't take back." "I know," he said, his gaze unwavering. "But I also know that pretending it's not there won't make it go away." Jessica looked at him, her heart aching. With the weight of their shared silence, she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. He was trying so hard to contain his emotions. In that moment, she realized she wasn't the only one fighting a battle she couldn't win. Nathan reached out his hand, hovering just above her, as he hesitated, giving her a chance to pull away, but she didn't. When his fingers finally brushed against her, it was with the weight of their shared silence. She could see the vulnerability in his eyes. He was trying so hard to contain raw emotion. In that moment, she realized she wasn't the only one fighting a battle she couldn't win. Nathan reached out his hand, hovering just above her. He hesitated, giving her a chance to pull away, but she didn't. When his fingers finally brushed against her, it was as if a spark had been ignited. The faint contact sent a jolt of electricity through her. The distance between them disappeared in an instant. Jessica didn't know who moved first, but suddenly they were closer than they had ever been. Their breaths mingled in the charged air. Nathan's hand traced her cheek. His touch was warm and steady, grounding her in a moment that felt both surreal and inevitable. A spark of connection ignited between them, sending an electric jolt through Jessica. The distance between them disappeared in an instant. She wasn't sure who moved first, but they were suddenly closer than ever before. Their breaths mingled in the charged air. Nathan's hand traced the contours of her cheek. His touch was warm and steady, anchoring her in a moment that felt both surreal and inevitable. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Jessica's eyes searched his, her heart pounding as she teetered on the edge of a decision she couldn't unmake. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she leaned into his touch with her own hand, finding its way to his. Their first kiss was tentative, a soft brush of lips that sent shock waves through her entire being. "Stop," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Jessica's eyes searched his, her heart pounding as she teetered on the edge of a decision she couldn't unmake. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she leaned into his touch with her own hand, finding its way to his. The first kiss was tentative, a soft brush of lips that sent shock waves through her entire being. It was a kiss filled with unspoken emotions, a quiet confession of everything they had been too afraid to say. As it deepened, so did the connection between them. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable crumbled under the weight of their shared desire. When they finally pulled away, Jessica's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. The kiss was full of unspoken emotions. It was a quiet confession of everything they had been too afraid to say. As they kissed, the connection between them grew stronger. The barriers that had once seemed impossible to overcome crumbled under the weight of their shared desire. When they finally pulled away, Jessica's breath came in shallow gasps. Her mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. Nathan's forehead rested against hers. His eyes were closed, as if he too was struggling to make sense of it all. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. His voice was tinged with both regret and longing. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Jessica shook her head. Her hands were still resting against his. "Don't apologize," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what this means, but I can't pretend it didn't." Nathan's forehead was against hers, and he had his eyes closed, as if he was trying to understand what was happening. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, sounding both sorry and like he wanted something. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Jessica said, shaking her head. Her hands were still on his. "Don't apologize," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what this means, but I can't pretend it didn't happen." Nathan nodded. He looked confused, but determined. "I'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady, even though he felt like a storm was inside him. They sat together in the dim room. The world outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Jessica felt like this was just the start of something much more complicated than either of them could. Nathan nodded, his expression conflicted but determined. "I'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. As they sat in the dimly lit room, the world outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than either of them could have imagined. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains in Jessica's bedroom, casting a golden glow over the room. She lay on her side, her body still and her mind racing. She stared at the faint patterns the morning light painted on the wall. The air felt heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Every sound seemed amplified, the faint chirp of birds outside. She imagined the first rays of sunlight filtering through the thin curtains in her bedroom, casting a golden glow over the room. She lay on her side, her body still, her mind racing. She stared at the faint patterns the morning light painted on the wall. The air felt heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Every sound seemed amplified, the faint chirp of birds outside, the distant hum of a car engine, the steady thrum of a heartbeat. She hadn't slept much. The events of the previous night played on a loop in her mind. Vivid and inescapable, her lips still tingled from the memory of Nathan's kiss. The warmth of his touch lingered on her skin like an echo. She couldn't shake the line they had crossed. It felt bold and glaringly impossible, even though it had been so faint and undefined before. Jessica turned onto her back, her hands resting on her stomach, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She didn't know what would happen next or how she would face the day. She felt both dread and longing, confused and overwhelmed. She didn't know how to deal with a soft knock at the door that broke the quiet morning. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as she sat up, her heart pounding. She didn't have to guess who it was. She knew it was Nathan. She ran a hand through her messy hair, trying to calm herself down, even as her thoughts spiraled. "Jessica," Nathan's voice was soft and hesitant, yet laced with. Jessica didn't know how to deal with a soft knock at the door that broke the quiet morning. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding. She didn't have to guess who it was. She knew it was Nathan. She ran a hand through her messy hair, trying to calm herself down, even as her thoughts raced. "Jessica." Nathan's voice was soft and hesitant, yet urgent, which made her pulse quicken for a moment. She considered pretending not to hear him, letting him think she was still asleep, but she couldn't avoid this forever deep breath. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed and stood, her bare feet sinking into the soft carpet. "Come in," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. The door opened slowly, and Nathan stepped inside. She felt an urgent need to do something, but she wasn't sure what. She thought about pretending not to hear him, but she couldn't do that forever. She took a deep breath and stood up, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. Her bare feet sank into the soft carpet. "Come in," she said, her voice steady even though she felt like she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The door opened slowly, and Nathan stepped inside. He looked as restless as she felt. His hair was unkempt, and his expression was uncertain. His gaze met hers, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The silence felt thick, filled with tension. "Morning," Nathan said finally, his voice low and measured. Jessica replied, her tone cautious. She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she felt standing there in her oversized t-shirt. She looked as restless as she felt. His hair was unkempt, and his expression was uncertain. His gaze met hers, and neither of them spoke for a moment. The silence was thick, filled with unspoken tension. "Morning," Nathan said finally, his voice low and measured. "I'm sorry," Jessica replied, her tone cautious. She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she felt, standing there in her oversized t-shirt. Nathan stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him. The gesture felt intimate, as if they were sealing themselves away from the rest of the world. He hesitated, shoved his hands into the pockets of his sweatpants, and then spoke again about last night. His voice trailed off as if he didn't know how to finish the thought. Jessica looked away, her cheeks flushing, unable to bring herself to say anything. Shirt and Nathan walked further into the room, closing the door behind them. The gesture felt intimate, like they were sealing themselves away from the rest of the world. He hesitated, shoved his hands into the pockets of his sweatpants, and then spoke again about last night. His voice trailed off as if he didn't know how to finish the thought. Jessica looked away, her cheeks flushing. She couldn't meet his eyes, afraid of what she might see there. "We don't have to talk about it," she said quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. "It was a mistake." Nathan flinched. The word cutting through the air like a knife. "A mistake," he echoed, his tone somewhere between hurt and disbelief. "Is that really what you think?" Jessica clenched her fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She didn't want to say it. She met his eyes, her voice trembling. "We don't have to talk about it," she said quickly. "It was a mistake." Nathan flinched. "A mistake," he echoed, his tone somewhere between hurt and disbelief. "Is that really what you think?" Jessica clenched her fists at her sides. "I didn't want to diminish what had happened, but what choice did I have?" she asked, forcing the word out. "You shouldn't have taken a step closer. I know you felt it too. I know you did." Nathan's voice was firm. "You felt it too. I know you did." Jessica's eyes snapped to his. Her anger flared in response to his insistence. "It doesn't matter what I felt," she shot back. "It was wrong. I didn't want to make it seem like what happened didn't matter, but I couldn't just forget about it." Nathan took a step closer, showing how upset he was. "You can't just act like it didn't mean anything," he said, his voice firm. "I know you felt it too. I know you did." Jessica looked at him, her anger flaring in response to his insistence that it didn't matter what she felt. "It was wrong," she shot back. "We both know that." Nathan's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. "Maybe it wasn't right," he admitted, his voice softening. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't real." The sincerity in his words took the wind out of her sails. Jessica sank onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation settled over her once more. "Nathan," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "This can't happen again." He sat. Nathan's jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists. "It wasn't right," he admitted, his voice softening. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't real." Jessica sank onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation settled over her once more. "Nathan," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "This can't happen again." He sat down beside her, leaving just enough space between them to make the distance feel deliberate. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said gently. "But I can't just go back to the way things were." Jessica looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together as she struggled to find the right words. "We have to," she said finally. "We don't have a choice." Nathan didn't respond immediately. He sat down next to her, leaving a little space between them. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said, his voice gentle. "But I can't just go back to how things were." Jessica looked down at her hands, her fingers intertwined. She tried to find the right words. "We have to," she said. Nathan didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and stared at the floor. "I'm not sure I can," he said after a long pause. "Not when I know how I feel." Jessica felt her heart ache when she heard the raw emotion in his voice. She wanted to reach out and comfort him, but she couldn't trust herself. Every look felt like a step closer to the edge of a cliff. She wasn't ready to fall. "We'll figure it out," she said, though. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and stared at the floor. "I'm not sure I can," he said after a long pause. "Not when I know how I feel." Jessica felt heartache when she heard the raw emotion in his voice. She wanted to reach out to comfort him, but she couldn't trust herself. Every look felt like a step closer to the edge of a cliff. She wasn't ready to fall. "We'll figure it out," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Nathan nodded slowly, though his expression was far from resigned. "If that's what you want," he said, standing. "I need you to know this isn't just going to go away. Not for me." Jessica watched him as he turned and left the room. The door clicked shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of his words lingered long after. Her voice didn't sound sure, but for now, "We have to keep our distance." Nathan nodded slowly, though his face didn't show resignation. "If that's what you want," he said, standing up. "I need you to know this isn't just going to go away. Not for me." Jessica watched him as he turned and left the room. The door clicked shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of his words lingered long after. He was gone. She lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling as her thoughts spiraled once more through the day ahead of her, daunting and uncertain. Jessica knew the coming hours would be filled with forced smiles and polite conversations, all while the tension between them simmered just beneath the surface. She had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again.